welcome again to our web conference today. I am Ashley Jimenez with Prevent Connect, and you are joining us for Creating Stories for Gender Justice, a narrative and culture change strategy to prevent sexual and domestic violence. Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CalCASA. So at this point, I am really excited to introduce you to our facilitators, our friends and colleagues at Prevention Institute. Alicia and Abina, welcome. It's always so great to get to work with you on web conferences. So how are you both today? And thank you for helping bring this conversation to the Prevent Connect community.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. It's Alicia. Hi, Abina.
Hey, Alicia. Happy to be joining today.
And thank you to Abina for sharing her screen so we can all see the slides today. So we're really excited about today's discussion because on Prevent Connect, we often talk about engaging multi-sector partners, and it's really great to see even just from what you all shared in the chat about who you are. We've got lots of different partners at the table today, and we have guests that represent artists, storytellers, culture makers, and even a data scientist. So the reason that we have these guests today is because we're talking about culture change. And our objectives really include diving into the importance of narrative and cultural strategy for our field, learning about audiences and their values, and seeing how narrative strategy can be used for gender justice. And one exciting thing is we even have a call to action related to storytelling today. So more about that later on, but just to pique your interest, there will be a call to action today too. So as always, we like to make this time interactive, and I know many of you are already engaging in the chat, but we want to continue that throughout the session. So please, click on that chat and join in. And we're starting off with one question, really general here, want to get your thoughts. What in our culture or what in our cultures supports safety from violence? And what in our cultures might contribute to sexual and domestic violence? So please, again, join in on the chat. We'll come back and see what's coming up there. So when we talk about sexual and domestic violence prevention, we often discuss norms and culture that shape conditions and experiences. And these are really seen as kind of the unwritten guidelines. When it comes to sexual violence, Prevention Institute talks about norms in the 5 ways that you see outlined on the right side of the slide. So we talk about things like harmful norms of masculinity and femininity with rigid and binary definitions. We talk about norms that support abuse of power, statements like, what do you expect? That's what strong leaders do. Or things like the tolerance of aggression and violence. And then the last one, seeing violence as a private matter, not a public concern. The idea that it's none of my business, or it's none of our business. As our guests share the ideas around stories and narrative today, I hope we can think about how we can change culture in ways to address these types of norms and really support the positive elements of our culture that can advance justice. So love to hear what's coming up in the chat. But first, I also wanted to make a connection here to this graphic that you're seeing on your screen. And it's talking about mental health, but I think it applies to a range of issues, including gender-based violence. And this idea that if we want to achieve justice, if we want to prevent sexual and domestic violence, we need to dig deeper. We need to think about, we need to think about racism. We need to think about poverty, oppression. And so I really liked this graphic because I'm hoping that in our conversation today, we can dig deeper and really talk about how we can achieve justice. So going to our text chat, I'm wondering if Ashley and Tori, what you've been seeing coming up.
Sure, Alicia. This is Ashley, and I can start, and then I'll pass it over to Tori. In terms of what creates a lack of safety, I've seen a lot around. Sorry, I have them all right here, and now I've lost my space. But so victim blaming, white supremacy, this normalization of sexual harm, a lack of spaces to talk about sex and sex education, stereotypes around gender. There's also folks. A couple of people brought up trauma, so like ACEs and sexual entitlement. But Tori, I think I'll pass it over to you to see what folks were saying around safety.
Yeah, thank you. So for safety, I'm seeing folks talking about positive social norms. I have also seen folks talking a lot about community, whether that's just building community and belonging and having support in general, or community accountability too. So it's really great to see folks, thinking of community solutions for violence too. And I also see the same with the connection to ACEs and supporting folks across the lifespan. There are more coming in, my goodness. Yeah, so again, awareness and education, empowerment, resiliency. Lisa's most recent comment in here about addressing the whole person, that is really a really great thing to bring this conversation to.
Thank you, Ashley and Tori. I know it moves fast, so appreciate you helping summarize that. I also saw someone speaking about belonging, and I think that's an important piece, especially right now in the context that we're all in right now. So if we move ahead in our slides, we want to get right into introducing our guests today. We're really excited about our 4 guests that we have. So we have guests both from the Center for Cultural Power and Story at Scale. For Center for Cultural Power, we have Fabiana Rodriguez and Kat Ivasco. Fabiana is the co-founder and president of the Center for Cultural Power, a national organization investing in artists and storytellers as agents of positive social change. She's an award-winning artist and cultural strategist and social movement leader. And Kat is a queer Filipina immigrant writer, comedian, theater artist, and senior program director at the Center for Cultural Power. Kat's work centers themes of immigration, family, LGBTQ rights, and sex positivity. I'm also going to introduce our guests from Story at Scale, but just want to let Fabiana and Kat say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you both. And from Story at Scale, we have Liz Mann and Ricky Conry. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Liz is a former independent film marketing executive who is a cultural strategist for social change and co-director of Story at Scale. And Ricky is a social psychologist and a data scientist for social change. She works with artists, activists, policymakers, and social media specialists using data to expand the reach of their work. And I'll let the two of you also say hello, and please correct me if I mispronounced your last name.
Pronunciation was perfect. Hi, folks.
That's right. Hi.
Thank you all for being here. So I know Fabiana is going to help kick us off in our conversation, and I think we wanted to start off really general. What is the Center for Cultural Power?
Yes, hello, everyone. I am an artist. I was born and raised in Oakland, and I grew up when the Black Panthers still had some remnants here in the Bay Area, and I grew up always in the birth of hip hop. And I always knew that culture was a very powerful language that could inspire people despite our hardships, that we could always find a way to sing and a way to talk about our resilience. And as an artist, I always felt that social justice movements didn't really see the value of our work, and that we were not fully included as narrative creators and as futurists. And so the Center for Cultural Power was born to help organize and support artists to imagine a world in which power is distributed equally and we are living in harmony with nature. We create thriving ecosystems for artists and culture makers to help dismantle systems of oppression, dismantle white supremacy, which is so rampant in the cultural space, and to develop transformative cultural practices that can help shift culture. And we do that through fellowships, trainings, content creation, activations, supporting artists to create their own small institutions and to get engaged. And we are consistently working with social movements so that we are informed and that we are working in collaboration to move forward progressive policies that'll help us win.
Thanks. That was a great overview, and glad that you were able to share a little bit about yourself as well and make the connection to the work that you're doing today. So, you started to talk about, and even in the chat, I think Lucia might have mentioned, racial and gender justice. And there's been so much around that, especially in terms of racial justice, even just in the past month. How are you supporting racial and gender justice in your work?
Yes, so first it's important to understand that our worldview, the worldview that we live in today, which is the way that we see the world, and that includes how we see gender, how we see race, how we see our family structures, how we see ourselves, all of that is informed by culture. And culture in reality is a composition of myths and stories. As human beings, since we've been on this planet, we've been understanding our existence through science and through art. And myth making is what societies are organized around. I mean, so many of our laws today really have their origins in ideas, in social constructs. And so culture very much shapes gender, our understanding of gender, our understanding of race. I mean, just even imagine all the ideas that were ingrained around gender since all of you were children, and how those got reinforced in culture, whether it was in the books you read, in the television you watched, in how people engage with you. And so when we are talking about leveraging culture, what we are really saying is, how do we create the stories that will help not just dismantle systems of oppression, because that's critical, but also to help us imagine a future in which the gender binary doesn't exist, or a future in which white supremacy doesn't exist. Because as I mentioned before, the cultural systems that we see, not only are they perpetuating these old narratives, they are actually, the folks in leadership are overwhelmingly white men. So for example, in Hollywood, 96% of film directors are white. And so when you wonder why it is that we have representations of sexual assault that are normalized, why is it that on romance movie after romance movie, we actually don't see consent? Consent just doesn't happen on the screen. Why is that? It's actually because the people who are in power are creating content that is an extension of their thinking, and it's an extension of their power. And so when we have white men really have consolidated power in the entire cultural industry, I mean, it's not just Hollywood, it's sports, it's music, it's performance, visual arts, gaming. All of those ideas get translated into concepts that we interact with. And so how do we challenge that? Not only do we challenge that by having to build cultural power, which means that it's not just about representation, it's not just about having Latinos or Black folks create films, it's actually about having power. Because when you have power to finance, you have power to decide what's in a script, what kinds of teams are behind the camera. Perspective and gaze matters. And so when we are looking at how culture can disrupt these cycles, it's about creating a new worldview, right? And that new worldview will take years to normalize, but we have to begin to normalize, and it's already happening. And we also know that culture moves faster than politics. You know, I remember in 2014 when the TV series Transparent came out. And it was the first time, and excuse me, a few years before when Orange is the New Black came out, it was the first time that a Black trans woman was given a prominent role. And then Transparent was released, which was really a story about a transgender parent who was finding their way through their family, understanding them, and their community. That was all before marriage equity. That was before we had conversations around taking away the rights of transgender people or of bathrooms. Culture was already sharing these ideas with us. And so the powerful thing about culture is that it moves much faster than politics, and that culture allows us to feel and experience what a future can look like. And that means that we can start hearing songs. I mean, you know, I grew up with songs that were talking about stalking, right? I mean, my favorite 80s bands, all of those songs, so many love songs, are actually about stalking and not getting a no. So imagine what it would be like if we began to normalize conversations about consent in music, right? Where's the funding gonna come from that? How are we gonna inspire artists to do that? How are we gonna train them and give them leadership? And then finally, you know, when it comes to white supremacy, I mean, white supremacy really does a number on our brains, right? And what it, and this is from data, Alexis McGill, who is a part of our circle of culture experts, talks about how when you look at images of Black men and youth in hoodies overwhelmingly being called criminals, and when we see images of that, but we don't see positive images of Black men, that in our brains associations happen, right? On the other hand, we see images of white men in everything. I mean, they are falling in love with computers, they are fighting dragons, they're in outer space. White men can be anything. They actually represent the human complexity, right? And yet why don't we see people of color? When we don't see people of color, you know what happens is that we, in our brains, develop symbolism that ends up affecting policy. And so in our work at the Center for Cultural Power, and really the work that many of the speakers are doing today, is to really look at what narratives do we need to inspire cultural creators to help us advance and really create a fertile soil for idea shifting and for culture shifting that will then lead to policy shift. Because we have to remember, policy takes a long time. Policy is slow, culture is fast. The movement right now for the rising Black liberation movement is a clear idea. When culture moves, policy can follow.
Love that. There were so many things that I just want to like quote you on and put onto slides. That was really great. And in the audience, we're getting so many people in agreement and sharing similar things to what you've been saying. And I really like some of the things you said around culture moves faster than politics, and how you mentioned the idea of like the gaze. And it's true that a lot of media was created for, you know, white men's gaze, and the way that you kind of put it all together. Yeah, go ahead.
The next two slides actually I think will be helpful for people. It'll give you a visual reference. So we can go to the next slide, just because I think as an artist, I know that people remember things when they see them. But that we have to remember social change happens in three realms: in the realm of culture, politics, and economics. And we know, for example, that for years, as the parents and the families of those killed by guns, for years they were talking about the need to have, go back for a second, sorry, the need to have a change in gun laws, right? I mean, from Sandy Hook in 2012, there was definitely a culture shift that happens when you had a massacre of children. And yet we did not have change in the political sector and the economic sector. I mean, the Walmarts of the world and the Dick's Sporting Goods of the world could have done something then, but they didn't. But if we fast forward to 2018, when the youth at Stoneman Douglas High School actually took control of their narrative, and these were youth who were trained in journalism and in drama, took control of their narrative, and they activated other high influencers, many of who were artists. They were able to, within 2 weeks, have an influence in the realm of economics, and they ended up actually having an influence in the realm of politics. And so the cultural space helps move both spaces. Next slide. And how we can think about it is that change always has to happen in three spaces, right? Let's talk about political. We have to change the way we govern, right? We actually have to create a true deep democracy away from a winner-take-all mentality towards an egalitarian model. And those kinds of shifts require particular kinds of organizing. In the economic sector, we have to have a redistribution of resources. I mean, not just that, our entire economic model is built on the extraction of the natural world, which is actually a concept that allows for the commodification of human beings, animals, and the planet. And as a feminist, it is really a violation of the earth and really a violation of many living creatures, how our economic model is based on complete domination and extraction. And we have to move towards one that's generative. I mean, we know this from our friends at the climate sector, that a generative economy, and frankly, folks who are fighting for this are overwhelmingly women, because we know that we want to ensure that we have a planet for generations to come. But finally, in the realm of culture is where we change worldview, moving away from domination. Domination is punishment economies. It's militarized approaches. It's really how you're seeing the administration react right now, in a way of domination, not partnership, not collaboration. But in our worldview, we can move towards empathy, interdependence, because once we can think in that way, it'll allow us to actually design our systems of governance and our systems of resources, because our hearts will be moved. And frankly, we have to heal. We have to heal from what white supremacy has done. And once we can move into our healing, we then can move into a redistribution and a correction of a repair model so that we can move forward.
Yes, and thank you for this visual. I think that's really helpful to help make it concrete. Anything else that you'd like to share about your perspectives on narrative and culture strategy? I think there might be one more slide.
I think that's oh yes, this is a Liz Mann, Aaron Potts, and Jeff Chang came up with a wonderful, wonderful metaphor that I think is also very helpful for folks to remember, is that stories are like individual stars, right? Whether the star of Trayvon Martin, the star of Oscar Grant, the star of Breonna Taylor, and narratives connects those stars so that they form constellations. And those constellations become so bright that we can't ignore them, that we actually know that these are patterns. These are things that are connected to each other. And so our role as culture makers is to create those stars, because you never know where your story is going to go. I mean, I don't think that, what was her name? Rachel de Hollander, who spoke out against Larry Nassar, I did not think she realized that 250 more victims would come out after her. And so our stories are needed. And in closing, I wanna say, we really have to trust artists, because it's artists who actually know how to popularize stories. It's what we do. We are storytellers, and we can no longer be left out of the social change infrastructure. For years, actually for over 50 years, there has been a divestment in the arts, largely informed by the early culture wars and Reagan. But it's time that we make bold moves to include artists and culture makers in our organizing, because it will actually make us stronger.
That's great, and a great call to action for everyone on this web conference today. Try and connect with the artists in your community as you're trying to advance these goals of gender justice and preventing sexual and domestic violence. I know that Fabiana's going to be getting off the web conference, so just want to say thank you so much for joining us, even though you could only join for a short period. We really appreciate it, and we're glad that Kat is sticking around to represent the Center for Cultural Power. So
thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Hi, Fabi.
And I'd like to invite Liz into the conversation now from Story at Scale. Liz, can you share a little bit about Story at Scale and provide your perspectives on how kind of you all talk about narrative and culture strategy?
Sure. Thank you for inviting us, and thanks for having us, and great to see Fabiana, one of my running buddies and fellow travelers in cultural strategy for many, many years. So that was great to hear her speak. So Story at Scale was a year-long narrative research effort designed to advance gender justice, and it's intended for use by artists and advocates and organizers working on issues from sex and gender-based violence to reproductive justice to trans rights, pay equity, et cetera, any of the myriad of issues that have gender as part of the connecting tissue between them. Our lens was intersectional, looking at gender with respect to both race and class. It delivers 3 tools that are, and there's many, many things at the storyatscale.org website. We'll send you out links and kind of a reading guide to help you navigate all the resources on the site. But we're just going to talk about a few high-level things. So it delivers audience research, which my colleague Ricky Conry is going to speak about momentarily. Something called a story platform, which I'll get to momentarily. And then we also did some production and testing. So if audience research is about understanding who we are speaking with, the story platform helps us understand what we want to be saying. And production and testing was really an opportunity for us to figure out how to connect our stories with audiences, really test drive the tools before disseminating and passing along these tools and resources and findings to implementation partners like everyone who's on the call today and the Center for Cultural Power and people working across the issues and with different kinds of storytellers. All of our materials are Creative Commons. It was funded by the Culture Change Fund. Anyway, there's lots of resources. They're all on the website. Okay, so I'll go into a little bit of the theory behind our work, right? So with conventional advocacy, we're usually focused on altering policies, laws, and elections through these kind of parallel and usually siloed programs like strategic communication. Sounds like there's a lot of comms people on the call today, grassroots and field organizing, and legal and public policy advocacy. And these 3 things are often referred to using a classically terrible male war like metaphor as the air game and the ground game or the inside game. And they've historically been campaign oriented with a near-term time horizon. Next slide, please. So, but with cultural and narrative strategy, our focus is on shifting narratives and norms over the long haul. So this is in addition to influencing policies, laws, and elections. Like we've all got a busy year here in 2020. So it's in addition, not instead of. And we do this by adding 2 key elements. One of them is cultural organizing, and a number of the things that Fabi was just speaking about. Van Jones, Fabi, others have called cultural organizing the heart game for its emotional connection with audiences. Cultural organizing centers artists and culture makers and fan communities as agents of social change. And then the other thing that we add is this, something we call the story platform. And this is a narrative basis that undergirds and weaves together all audience engagement efforts. So whether the air game, the ground game, the inside game, the heart game, whatever kind of audience and community engagement work you're doing, the direct service, a number of you are direct service organizations, the storytelling and the story listening that you're doing is all being done in this kind of coordinated and mutually reinforcing way to counter the harmful narratives that need countering, but also to advance the narratives that are our vision for this just, equitable, and inclusive future. that we're all talking about driving toward. Does that help a little bit, Alicia, in terms of framing what this project was? It's not I should clarify, Story at Scale isn't an ongoing institution. It was a single project that is more or less now complete. And it's kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom out there.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I'm trying to think about what you just shared, and also what Favi shared, and like, you know, stories as stars, and the interconnectedness with the story platform, and kind of putting it all together. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about what kind of stories we should be considering telling, what kind of came up from the work that you did this past year.
Sure. So I'm happy to share with you the story platform that came out of this sort of co-creative 77 co-creators movement, artists and activists and organizers and advocates, that was developed through the context of the Story at Scale project. We've put the URL on the slide, storyatscale.org story platform. It's a little bit hard to read these. So our story platform is really all about this joy-filled life in a gender-just world. It's very much about belonging, and this is a term we've already heard multiple times today. We really talk about this story platform as writing a new future for people of all genders, right? So this is a place of radical inclusivity and liberation. Story platforms are accompanied, or they're sort of built up by what we call story pillars, these visual forms that you're seeing on screen right now. The first pillar, and we call these kind of rich storytelling areas. So these are the kinds of stories, and maybe I should pause for a second here and just say a story platform and story pillars, it's not the same as a message frame, right? It's not uniform words. It's really this kind of connective, emotional, and flexible tissue that advances a new vision for the world. And Kat will talk about it a little. This is a little bit theoretical, and Kat from the center will talk shortly about kind of the practical implications. So the first pillar is about joy and pleasure and fun. And this is, you know, the ability to create your own identity and enjoy life and love as you wish. The second pillar is about abundance, and it's a shift from our typical and frequent scarcity mindset. The third, and is very relevant to sex and gender-based violence work, the third is about safety within our communities, within our homes, within our relationships. The fourth is recognizing that we're all different, but we're equally seen and valued. The fifth is about sustainability, a healthy and nurturing ecosystem. And then finally, the co-creators talked a lot about curiosity in kids as really being this strong pathway to the future. I think, you know, all I want to say is these aren't taglines, they're not ad copy. These are ideas for stories which will get us towards this liberatory and joy-filled life that we are looking for.
That's an important distinction, so thanks for sharing that. And I'm going to ask Abina to keep it on this slide for a minute, because I want everyone to be able to see these pillars as I ask the next text chat question. And just wanted to know what's coming up for all of you, what story pillars kind of are standing out to you as you're seeing them right now. So, you know, please use the text chat to share what's standing out to you right now. And I'm also going to invite Kat back into the conversation here from the center. And Kat, I'm hoping that you can share a little bit about what pillars you're focused on and how you really use those pillars to craft your core narrative.
Sure. Thank you for that. And yeah, actually, if we could just go back to the pillar slide real quick. I just want to share that, you know, out of a lot of different narrative strategies we've seen, the Story at Scale work has been the most thorough and robust tool that we're so excited to activate. And so at the Center for Cultural Power, what we did was we took these pillars and started to go deeper into it. And really, like, I think that's the great part about this is it's not prescriptive in terms of how you use it. And so for us, it was how do we take these pillars and how do we apply it to the core issues that we want to address in our gender justice work? We know that gender justice is a very big umbrella, right? And, you know, in this year, we really wanted to focus specifically on three issues that we wanted to address. The first one is ending cycles of violence. The second is equitable labor, and the third is pleasure and joy. And so from these pillars, what we did is we went deeper into them and started developing core narratives that we are putting into cultural briefs. And these cultural briefs are essentially what we are going to give artists that we commission to help inspire and guide their creative process. And so we could advance to the next slide. So we took these pillars and we decided to create these core narratives. And this is what we're working from now. So as you could tell, like we didn't really deviate too far from the pillars, but we just wanted to really focus on what stories then are we focusing on, right? So joy and pleasure, we want to show stories that show diverse experiences of joy and pleasure, stories of self-celebration with diverse bodies and genders. We want, more stories that reflect joys of life, being free, you know, to create your own identity, enjoy love with partner. What does loving relationships look like? What does healthy communities look like? And then we went into abundance and not scarce. And this is around stories of economic equity and how people can thrive and make decent living, right? And the next is the transformational healing and access to healthy communities, stories of belonging, building and organizing safer communities. And I think right now, this is actually like a core narrative that we're feeling a lot because since COVID and everything, we're moving into a culture of collective care, which is really exciting and something that we're really uplifting in our work right now, resources to thrive. And then that we are all interconnected again, that, you know, we all have to win. Like it can't just be one group or the other, right? We really have to support one another through this work. And so those are the kind of core narratives that we are sharing with our artists. And there's multiple projects we're working on in our gender justice program that I could share more a little bit later, but that's kind of how we started working with the pillars.
Thanks, Kat. You're leaving us wanting to know more, so we're definitely going to come back to hear more about what that's looking like. But going back to the chat and seeing what's coming up, folks have been sharing all sorts of pillars that are really resonating for them. And I think some that are standing out to me here are around like equity, safety at home, community. And I thought it's really interesting that people haven't necessarily like thought about the joy and pleasure one as much before. And someone mentioned about how you can kind of lose that when you're working with victims. And so figuring out how to elevate joy and pleasure in narratives is, I think, maybe something people are interested in exploring more. So thank you all for sharing that. Tori and Ashley, anything that you want to add from the chat that stood out to you?
Just that I really, the joy and pleasure platform really resonated with me too, and I'm just really loving hearing or reading everyone's contributions to this conversation.
Yeah, and I really like what Liz just shared in the chat too, that a lot of the folks on the front lines who are most drained and exhausted by their work and trauma were the ones who insisted that joy, pleasure, and abundance needed to be centered. So I think that's a really important theme there. Thank you for sharing that, Liz. So we're definitely going to come back to the story pillars and, you know, application of them with Kat again. But, you know, we can't forget about our audience. You know, we know it's important to think about our audience when we're creating our stories, and Ricky is going to now join in on the conversation and share about, you know, the research that was done as part of Story at Scale on audience segmentation. So Ricky, do you want to share a little with us?
I will. Sorry, I'm going to go dark because my internet's not as reliable as I want it to be. So I'm here behind the video. I think the biggest thing to know about audience, and I'm a data scientist and I do audience for social change, and I've been doing this basically exclusively for like 5 years. And the most important thing to know about an audience is that you don't make a message for an audience. We only have one narrative here, and it's the narrative that we want to be narrating to the world. And when I say we, it's not me, the data scientist who came up with this. I didn't ask the audience what message frame works best for them. We gave the movement literally space, like we just financed them to spend a half a day in a room talking about what future they wanted. And when they can take that space, Jacqueline, I think you lifted this up, take that space, step back from the work on the streets every day, what they want to be putting forward is a vision of a future where everyone is welcome. And so the role of audience is not so that we can carefully craft an authoritarian message for the authoritarian and a kumbaya message for the hippie. The role of audience is so that we can know how we can tell stories and what cultural opportunities exist for us in the individual subcultures or audiences that we want to bring our narrative forward to or lift our narrative up in. There are opportunities in every audience. We found these particular audiences using a survey, and that survey is really important because we did a lot of really deep listening in the survey to marginalized communities. And so you'll see some differences here between a political segmentation and this set of 6 groups. This is not a set of political positions on gender justice or any other kind of issues. We based this set of groups on the lived gender stories that people are experiencing and the gender stories they want to live. So Justice Rising, many people here in this meeting will be Justice Rising. They're creative leftists and their core concerns are safety and freedom. The other slightly more than half of the progressive left is Force for Good, thinking leftists who want progress and equality. And then in the sort of political middle, we have 3 groups. Kids First, self-identify as parents and grandparents first, and they want their kids to grow up well. For the Win is leaders who want to have a good time and to win. And No Special Treatment is rule followers who want recognition and achievement. None of these groups is the group that we're going to change in order to change our gender justice future. They exist in different places, although there's a little of everyone everywhere, and they have different stories to tell and they can hear stories differently. For the room that we're in today, I want to lift up a couple of things that make these groups different. Kids First and For the Win embrace the gender binary, and it's personally very important to them. So both of those groups of people would say, being a woman is very important to me, or being a man is very important to me. And so that identity as a woman or a man is very important to those 2 groups. Both of those groups are also mostly progressive in their sort of overall opinions about things. All 5 of the groups on the left here are people who support legal abortion. But Kids First and For the Win are the most likely to say that the changes happening around gender in the United States, and this happened before the COVID crisis, so Me Too was actually really popping at the time. Those changes are making this group a little uncomfortable. They think they could be bad or both bad and good. And No Special Treatment's really important, partly because they're really important in Michigan, and Michigan is really important, but also that's a group of people who are really steeped in they're very vulnerable to some of the more toxic Fox News and Breitbart style content. So they are potentially gettable, but we need to be helping to inoculate them from the toxic messages from the far right. The final thing I will say about these audiences is that we do have this final group, religious traditionalists, whom we don't talk that much about. And the only thing I want to say there is that's not all people of faith in the US. That's people who are most likely to identify as born again, they're anti-abortion, and they're not super accessible to the gender justice movement. But people and communities of faith are extremely important in the fight against sex and gender-based violence, and there are many of those in Kids First and No Special Treatment. Here's the thing. I'm going to talk about values for a second because I always talk about values. So here's the important thing about doing audience segmentation in general is that we're standing over on the far left, or else I'm not reading the room correctly, right? And there's some group over on the far right. And when we think about our audience for the content that we make, we either think about talking to ourselves, which is fine, Or we think about trying to counter something that's coming for the right. But when we put these people on an ideology spectrum, this is actually these folks modeled onto a voter file, and then we take what we know about whether they're progressive or conservative. We do learn one thing, which is that religious traditionalists are right-wing conservatives. And we learn virtually nothing about the rest of America. Just being able to know that someone is progressive or conservative isn't enough to be able to write a story that meets them where they are with respect to their gender story, because everyone's living a gender story, not everyone's living a political story. Do you want to flip forward? We'll look at the values.
Yeah, can you share a little bit more about these core values and who influences these different audiences?
The most important thing when we decide we're not going to just organize the world into a left-right binary is to have some other organizing principle, and we use values. That's because values are goals. They're abstract psychological representations of what you want out of life. So the kinds of values that Favi and the Center for Cultural Power are putting into the world are very community values. That's about empathy and equality and sharing and being able to hold more than one thing at a time. But all of us can understand and acknowledge where people are coming from who have a security value or an autonomy value. All of us are in that place sometimes. And so knowing there are three things to say about values for these audiences. The first is that we here in the progressive base are force for good and justice rising, and we share core values, those core community values, universalism and benevolence. That means that we can co-write a narrative together, even though sometimes it feels really hard. The second thing to know is that none of our persuadable audiences, For the Win, No Special Treatment, and Kids First, share the same values as each other. Kids First, which is an audience that a lot of folks really want to talk to because they are politically progressive and they are reliable voters, they don't actually share as their core driving set of values the community values. Instead, they tend to endorse values around tradition and family and security and staying safe. For the Win, also an important audience, a little bit less civically engaged, but super important. And really likely, both men and women in this group to prefer very traditional gender roles. In fact, the question that sets this group apart from the others is that they believe a man should make more in a relationship with a woman. These folks are really, really focused on autonomy. So if we're telling stories into that group, we don't necessarily want to be as focused on the community aspects. We want to be focused on joy, pleasure, and fun. The way to get inside an audience, this is maybe the biggest thing I learned in Story at Scale, is that you can show graphs all day long about maps and like who's voting and whether they're progressive, and we can do demographics until the cows come home, and all the demographics are on the website in case you're curious. But the way to think about an audience is with its voice. So these are the cultural touch points, the people and brands that are already speaking to these audiences. These aren't social justice brands. These are just brands that have a voice that resonates. Justice Rising is Greta, Greta, Greta. They're also extremely, extremely young. And so they are very engaged with things like comics, online games, socks and shoes are a big deal in this audience because they're not spending all of their time thinking about gender justice. Although at the moment they are spending a lot of their time thinking about justice. Force for Good is very engaged with brands like Trader Joe's and ACLU. Both Liz and I are Force for Good. You can use the quiz to find out if you are too. Kids First, again, politically, the very similar profile to Force for Good, older, progressive, likely to vote, but really engaged with a very different kind of voice in our culture. And in particular, all of the brands that reach this group are circles and jewel tones. Lots of them are food related. For the Win is as far away as from this group as you can get in values, and it shows in the brands. They're hearing Cardi and Elon Musk. They care a lot about achievement. They want to be rich. And they are engaged with Nike, Red Bull, lots of booze and brands that are red, black, and gold. No Special Treatment is a really interesting group because a year ago or so when we were studying these folks, they were culturally very, very far from justice. I think we're seeing that this group is maybe the one that's moving the most on racial justice right now as key brands for them, including the NFL and NASCAR. are come around justice. That means that this group is an opportunity in a way that they have not been for us historically, but the voices that resonate with this group are middle class, middle of the road, middle of the country, white voices.
Thanks for sharing that. I think the seeing the influencers and brands really helps with the increasing understanding of these different segments. And you did start to mention a little bit about how increased attention to calls for racial justice might affect these audiences. But anything else to share about how you think this audience research might have changed since you did it? I know you can't give us like a scientific answer, but just any impressions.
I can give some scientific answer. I did some analysis today of the media that these groups are most likely to be engaged with. These segments are fundamentally about gender and people's lived gender experience and their story of gender, but because we are all living a gender story, these are segments that really affect a lot of things outside of gender. Gender and race are two of the big meta narratives that shape everything we experience as Americans. So these groups are existing in very different media places. And so I can tell you a few things. All of these groups are experiencing a lot of hardship around COVID. And in particular, For the Win and religious traditionalists are spending a lot of time searching online to find out when their stimulus checks are coming. What that means is that those people are experiencing a lot of financial hardship, which is terrible, but it's also a moment in which we can reach them on economic justice in a way that would have been hard 6 months ago. Because those are two groups that believe in bootstrapping, in making your own way, in hustle, and are now really struggling and need that community focus. Justice Rising is engaging a lot with union content and content that is focused on capitalist oppression, but nobody's focusing much on gender right now, which is not very surprising. One important thing to know about For the Win is that this is a great moment to activate this relatively inactive group politically, but they do have a couple of core beliefs about how the world should work that we should be aware of. One is that For the Win is the most likely group to say that we should prioritize racial justice over gender justice, rather than prioritizing both at the same time. So there's an opportunity there to put gender justice right in the same line as racial justice. And the other is that For the Win really does believe in conventional gender roles, and in particular is very invested in the idea that men should make more than women. And so when we are talking to that group, the content that we made that was the most successful was made by Fabi. And she started with the sentence, "I want to talk about pleasure." The best way to connect with For the Win right now, I think, is to start that story with sex.
Thanks, Ricky. And that's really impressive, the rapid research you've been able to do to help contextualize this even more in the moment that we're living in. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I know that Liz may have asked a chat question to ask people what audiences they're in. And I want to go to the next slide here to also ask everyone here, what audiences have you maybe thought less about that you might want to reach moving forward? So feel free to share that in the text chat. And I'd like to also bring Kat back into the conversation and ask how the Center for Cultural Power has been able to use some of this audience research.
Yes, thank you for that. And yeah, so, the work that Ricky's done has been really powerful. And so right now we're trying to connect specific pillars, because we know that certain pillars don't work with specific audiences, right? So I'll say that the audience pillar part has been the harder piece in terms of activating artists around, right? Like, I think if you give artists like story guidelines, they can rock with the pillars or the core narratives a little bit easier. But when you have artists think about audience, it really kind of stretches our thinking a little bit. As an artist myself, part of it is, yes, like, we know that artists have their own audience, right? But their audience might not be exactly the target audience when we're doing a specific pillar. So it's challenging artists right now to think about how they expand their audience beyond who they usually reach out to, right? And so I'll say that a lot of our work, a lot of our work at the Center for Cultural Power really focused on our audience, like the choir, right? We're, Force for Good folks and the left side of the spectrum. And I will say that in that spectrum too, in that part of the spectrum too, we really come to think about like the choir also needs to be interrogated, right? Like the choir, even though we know that their values are in the right place, they might not actually be acting on those things or voting on those things or voting, period, right? And so I think part of it is connecting the values to the behavioral change we want to see. And so that's kind of how we're approaching. And so for example, this project that we have with Caring Across Generations, and Caring Across Generations was also part of helping create Stories at Scale. And we knew that right now we also wanted to see how we could focus on kids first. And also with the whole Black liberation movement, we actually shifted our, the artists we brought in, and they're all Black artists for this project. And so this is an image from one of our artists that's part of the Midwest Culture Lab, which is a collective of artists that we support across Ohio, Milwaukee, and Chicago. So James Quarles is actually from Cleveland, Ohio. And this campaign that we're doing with Caring Across Generation focuses on caregiving, right? And collective care. And this is an image of his cousin and their grandmother. And his cousin is actually a caregiver who was infected by COVID, unfortunately. And so we wanted to uplift in this, in these images, the kind of collective caregiving that already happens in Black communities and in Black families. And that there are Black caregivers out there. And so this is one of the first images. This is a sketch, so please don't share it out in public yet. We're still giving the artist some feedback, and we're working on a few drafts, but I just wanted to give y'all a sneak peek of one of the new images that we've been working on. But yeah, so those are ways that we've been thinking about it. And I think it's gonna take us a little bit more time to really figure out how to finesse, integrating the audience survey, the audience research into our commission and our cultural briefs, but we're starting to experiment with it now.
Thanks, Kat. And yeah, this really seems to connect to some of the norms that we mentioned earlier on, and thinking about equitable gender norms. And then I also know, sorry, that the sexual and domestic violence prevention field has been thinking a lot about economic security and economic support for families. So see lots of connections with this idea of caring across generations here as well. Anything else you want to share more about caring across generations? Or I know you've also been doing some masculinity work.
Yeah, I'd like to share a few other projects we're working on. So we are launching a masculinity project. We don't have a fun name for it yet, but the whole idea of it is to reimagine what healthy masculinity looks like. And so we're bringing a group of artists together who are multi-genre artists, interdisciplinary artists. Some of them are filmmakers, musicians, performers, and they're mainly Black male identified. We have a trans Sri Lankan performing artist, and we have also one of our staff members, Jesus Iniguez, who's an undocumented immigrant, who's part of this group of folks. And so we're planning on partnering with an organization that could help us facilitate these conversations, and really let the men kind of emerge at new ideas or new stories or new images of what healthy masculinity looks like. And we haven't prescribed exactly like what art medium is going to come out of this, because we wanted them to collaborate and see what they want to work on together. So it could be a video, a music video, it could be a song, it could be a lot of things. So we're kind of approaching that with an emergent strategy and see what just kind of comes up to the surface. So that's the masculinity project we're working on. We're also, we were commissioned by the Culture Change Fund to do a gender justice coloring book. So we started receiving sketches from that, And that's another project where we did align the pillars with audience research and gave that to the artists, and we have been working with artists around developing images for that. And we've got a few sketches in already. And we're expecting to have those printed out by August, sorry, mid-August. So we're excited to share that with you once those are ready to go. But those are 3 projects that we're working at the Center for Cultural Power right now.
Very exciting, and I'm sure there's pieces that this group would love to follow up on and see as they come to fruition. So folks can definitely keep checking out on your website, and I know we also have a call to action today that we'll be sharing. But I just want to revisit the text chat. I know there's been a lot of discussion about different audience groups and people talking about who they feel like is most represented in their communities, who they may not have thought of, and just want to see if anything is coming up that you'd like to share, whether Ricky, Liz, or Tori, Ashley, anyone who wants to share anything from what you've been following in the text chat.
Well, Alicia, you know, a lot of folks were saying for the win, and really just kind of thinking about, you know, how do we build our capacity and be comfortable in reaching out to groups that, you know, we maybe are so far from in terms of like our values. So I don't know, I think that's such an interesting conversation, and that is definitely like a muscle that we have to build, I would imagine.
I mean, it's that one of the things we found in the testing, like sort of, you know, what are some of the pathways to connect? But because For the Win is over, like maybe we can go back to Ricky's values slide just to see sort of what quadrant they live in. Like a place to really connect with them is around pleasure and bodily autonomy and happiness and joy. So that's one bridge that I think is available. That's fun. Ricky, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you said what I was going to say. We actually tested a bunch of content, and the stuff that worked best with this group most reliably, both in persuasion and engaging them, was a little edgy and a little bit like, it's very sex forward, sex the activity, not gender. And I think that's really important. Treating this group with a lot of respect is also really important. This is a group that's focused on achievement, and they are very aware of the unfairness in the world, although they use different words to describe it than we do here in Justice Rising. But they also really want to be rich. Like, one of their top priorities in life is to be rich, which means that connecting with them on a sort of anti-capitalist message isn't going to work, but connecting with them on a personal autonomy and sex and pleasure perspective absolutely can.
And safety, like I'd be surprised if there aren't a lot of For the Win very active in the current Black Lives Matter protest movement.
Somebody mentioned that the folks in their life who are For the Win they bring a lot of energy and leadership, and that's true. For the Win is by far the most likely to want to be leaders at work, both the men and the women in this group, despite that they embrace some traditional gender roles. They want people to listen to them, and they want to lead, which makes them a potentially really valuable resource. One thing that Janae Cody, who helped us with this research, said, her husband is strong For the Win, is that a really important place to start with For the Win is there is nothing wrong with you. This group does have some young Black men in it, but it also has young people from all kinds of marginalized backgrounds. And so starting that conversation with "you're fine just the way you are" is very platform forward, and also a great way to start that conversation.
Thank you for adding to that. It's always nice when we can respond in real time, so appreciate that. For the audience, or for our participants in the web conference today, I want to put up one more text chat question and also ask if you have any questions for our guests, please also share those in the chat. But we want to hear from you. How might the story pillars help with your prevention work, and what kind of stories might you want to tell? And I did see in the chat, someone had mentioned around engaging men around valuing femininity in ourselves and others. And I thought that was a really important point. And just expanding the definition of masculinity even. And I've heard people talk about masculinities as a plural, so it's not just one thing. But yeah, anything else that you might want to share or questions that you might have, please share those in the chat. Kat, anything else that you'd like to share from the conversation that we've just been having right now? Or
Yeah, you know what, I just want to say that, you know, the slide that you had with the norms, like, you know, because we have a masculinity project, and it was like, it made me, I was like, wow, we do have really harmful ideas of femininity too, you know. So I was like, let me think about a project for that. So that was kind of exciting. But I think, you know, I just think, you know, one thing I wanted to share is I just recently watched the film Disclosure that recently premiered on Netflix. I don't know if y'all seen it. It's Laverne Cox is a part of it. But they really talk about, you know, like, and here's the other thing, representation is not going to move us to the kind of world we want, right? Because, like, for example, the representation of trans folks on TV has actually increased, but the violence against trans women have continued to increase as well, right? So it's not actually fighting that. What we realize this is not just about representation, it's about what stories we're actually telling. And in Disclosure, they talked about, you know, when we had movies with trans women, they had those scenes where they come out or they get outed to their love interest, who's usually a white male, and the white male always reacts in anger and violence, right? And so that normalizes that kind of reaction when trans women are outed. And so, you know, that really hit home for me and really made me think about, well, you know, one of the things that we want to do is create content around what does healthy relationship look like? And also, what does it look like when we're more emotionally aware and like self-regulated, so that anger doesn't have to always look like violence. It could also look like talking. It could also look, you know, it could look different ways. And so I just wanted to share that because I just wanted to really, you know, distinguish representation versus the narrative and the story as well.
totally, yeah, thanks for sharing that. There's a lot happening in the chat and I'm trying to keep up, but one thing that stood out to me was Rebecca shared in Ohio, a story that we want to tell is on the intersections between low wages, racism, and COVID. That sounds like really important stories to tell, and looking forward to seeing where that goes. Someone else wants to tell the story about gender-based violence and what it looks like in rural communities versus larger communities. That also sounds like an important story and really interesting to think about urban, rural, suburban, and the differences there. Also some conversation around sexual violence against children and what those stories might look like. Someone wrote, I'm curious about the idea of our community seeing ourselves in our stories, especially in stories outside the context of commodified narratives for products or public relations. Not sure if anyone has thoughts on that. And another one is, how do we ensure safety in the stories / narratives? And one more here that might be one that we can answer. Can story pillars help in beginning conversations with men about how they define what masculinity means to them?
I definitely think yes. And because we're going to be bringing the story pillars to our group of male identified folks who are part of the Masculinity Project, and also want to see how they, you know, how they incorporate that into the piece, the work that they're going to be doing. So we're definitely hoping that that helps spark that conversation.
I think that that really speaks to like a lot of the other stuff that's coming up, which is how can the folks that I work with, what can I tell them, and what stories can they tell me, and how can we lead them through storytelling? And I am a data scientist, but I will say that the most important thing that we found in testing was to tell a whole story. So that story needs to, there's trauma right at the start of that story for everyone that we are working with here in the sex and gender-based violence space. But there's also a future. And I think that being able to tell the story all the way to the end moves audiences, allows audiences to envision a future where sex and gender-based violence is not a problem and is not a secret and is something we all deal with together. And it also, I think, it was really interesting to watch the videos. I wasn't involved in production for any of the content we made, but it was really interesting to watch how people were able to tell their own stories and to bring their own stories to a conclusion, even if there was trauma involved, that was really powerful for them.
Yeah, I think trauma seems to be a theme we're seeing in the text chat right now. And anything more to share on kind of trauma-informed storytelling, or if that came up at all in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so, you know, in my own practice as a theater artist, I also do personal narrative storytelling workshops. And for me, I've always had a practitioner in the room, whether it was a social worker or clinician. You know, I'm an artist, I'm not a therapist, but like when we work with narratives, like people will go there depending on how safe they feel in the space, right? They will go to that place of trauma. And I always, I think we always want to be mindful about that, because we are not skilled to bring them out of that space, you know? And so for me, when we practice working with impacted communities, which is all the time, we always want to make sure that we have, you know, a professional in the room that can help guide should anyone get triggered through the process of storytelling, which happens all the time, you know? Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. So I would like to get you all to share kind of, you know, what your key takeaways are out of what you've shared today. And Kat, I know you also have a call to action. So if you don't mind sharing about that.
I muted myself. Yeah, I think, you know, the main takeaways is, you know, that art and narrative strategies help shape our culture and worldviews, right? Culture influences politics and economics. And right now we really need stories that imagine the future we want. And that's, you know, living in a world where culture, politics, and economy prioritize people over profit, where life is valued equally, you know, a future that is healthy, happy, and thriving, right? And so my call to action for you folks, because you are in this work, like frontline, and you are supporting so many folks, we want to invite you to share any stories with us at the Center for Cultural Power. As I mentioned earlier, we're developing cultural briefs for artist guide, like as and artist guides. And part of those cultural briefs, we don't want to just give them core narratives or also, artists don't do well with statistics and data. They like stories, and they like real stories, and they want to connect with folks in the communities that are most impacted. So I just created a Google form, and if we put it in the chat, you could fill out the Google form if you'd like to participate in that. And if you want us to contact you, because I'm sure you can't type a whole story like in one sitting, because I'm sure you have so many stories, but we're more than happy to reach out to you to help collect those stories so that we could put it in our archive that we will use with artists. So if you feel comfortable doing that, please join us and help us create these new narratives.
Really exciting and a great kind of collaborative opportunity. And I know some of you already shared some ideas of the kinds of stories that you want to tell. So this is a real tangible action that can come out of this web conference. So please do go visit the link. I just went on it, seems to be working great. It's showing up for me now. So that's great. Thanks for sharing, Kat. And also would like Liz and Ricky to share their key takeaways.
Ricky, why don't you take this?
All right, we did a bunch of testing, didn't talk about it at all. It's on the website. Here's the big thing. Tell a story. Works better than not telling a story. Don't tell somebody what to believe, tell a story. Make sure that that story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It needs to have a future. And you can tell that future. You don't have to meet an audience where they're at. Tell them the future you want. Just do it in a way that makes sense to them.
Thank you, Ricky. Yeah, this is, I know the message seems simple, but so important. And I know that sometimes it's harder to do than to say, but you all shared some great tools with us today that can help us in getting to these places and creating a better future. So thank you for that. We can go to our next slide and go into tools and resources. I do want to just check in with Tori and Ashley quickly and see if there's anything else that we'd want to elevate before we go into our tools and resources though.
Oh gosh, Alicia, I've been typing in the text chat and just, you know, again, just really, really enjoying listening to this conversation. And I think that I just want to say to our guests, you know, I've really learned so much and asking myself so many questions based on, you know, everything that you've led us through today. So that's all I can say. I have so much thinking to do.
Yeah, and there's been some great sharing in the chat, and I see Liz has been sharing lots of other resources and things, so thank you to all of our guests, but I guess we can move into resources. Tori has shared in the chat Story at Scale's resource guide and website, and Kat, if you want to just share a little bit about what No Going Back is.
Yeah, so after COVID, we knew we had to activate folks. So we actually created and started distributing this No Going Back Cultural Strategy Activation Guide for artists and activists. And so it kind of frames the kind of stories we want to see, different kind of campaign frameworks. So it's about a 30-page document that helps folks create at this time. So I just wanted to share that with all of you to take as a resource. And if you have any questions around that or want to learn more about our work, please feel free to reach out. We want to work with, like our work is, while we're centered with, we center artists in our work, we definitely have our core strategies to work with movement folks and folks at the front line. So yeah, if you have any questions about the Artist Guide, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'll put my email again in the chat here.
Perfect. Thanks, Kat. And on our next slide, we actually have some other resources from the field. So JSI actually created a resource that is about survivor stories and building partnerships. So what they did is lots of interviews and talking with survivors, and based on that, developed stories that aren't just one individual's experience, but kind of collective experiences in different realms that can be used for helping build multi-sector partnerships. And then I know the Idaho Coalition has been doing a lot around storytelling, especially with youth, and thinking about a collective future. So you can check that out. Also, Story Center has a Silent Speaks case studies with some global examples there. So lots of storytelling work happening. And of course, our guest today on our next slide, be sure to check out the Center for Cultural Powers website, Story at Scale, and we have Prevention Institute and Prevent Connects information here as well. So that is everything that we wanted to share today. And I really want to thank Liz, Ricky, Kat, Bobby, thank you all for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and coming into the space. We really appreciate it. And with that, I will let Ashley and Tori close us out.
Thank you, Alicia, and likewise, thank you to our guests today. Thank you to our audience for all of you know, the conversation and new ideas and just willingness to be part of this. I get to say it, happy Friday. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. We will be getting this recording up as soon as possible. You will also receive a post-web conference evaluation survey, and your feedback is always important to us. And at the end of it, there is an opportunity to download a certificate. So please, if you would, respond to that. And we do, Prevent Connect has a bunch of offerings for web conferences happening in July, which I cannot believe is next week. But hopefully if you are on our mailing list, you will get all of those announcements. And if you're not, then please connect with us and we'll make sure that you're on there. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and take care. We appreciate you and we will see you again soon. This concludes our web conference for today.